Before we go anywhere, two things. First, lots of the information that's come out about the situation has been tainted a little bit by player embellishment to a certain extent, so I've tried to separate the hyperbole from the facts just a little bit, but I'm not a journalist, so I'm not going to pretend to be one. And two, I'm not making accusations against any particular party in this situation, merely trying to consolidate every element of the story into one cohesive summary so that you don't have to go through reading a whole bunch of twitlongers or translating a whole bunch of tweets from players in a language you don't know. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the Six Invitational Latin American Closed Qualifier. It was meant to happen this past weekend on the 15th and the 16th that would determine who amongst MIBR, Black Dragons, Atheros Esports, Phoenix Esports, Furious Gaming, and Malvinas Gaming would be attending the Six Invitational in Stockholm next month. Also, surprise, SI is now in Stockholm. This was happening on land in Sao Paulo, Brazil, because there's a pretty big ping difference between Mexico to South America back to Brazil again, so this was deemed the fairest way to ensure the winner. But over the past 4 to 5 days, it's become a complete descent into hell for teams traveling from outside of Brazil, so let's try to wrap together what we know. To start with, all players needed to be vaccinated and have negative COVID test results to even get to Sao Paulo to begin with. Atheros already had issues with one of their players not being vaccinated, but the call was made to have their coach Royce play in his place, who did meet both requirements, as did every other player on every other team before the tournament began. Teams then arrive in Sao Paulo on the 13th and get whisked to their hotel. On the 14th, they get antigenic and PCR tests, all of which return negative, and they complete their media day obligations. Then they head to the venue to practice. But the first real red flag is that everybody is being transported in the same van. For context, the North American League sends shuttles for separate teams to help prevent more exposure than necessary, but every player for this event is instead getting to the venue via the same transport. It happens again on the 15th for the start of the tournament, where they take antigenic tests again, but Royce tests positive and prepares to play from a room separate from the main stage, away from the rest of his team. Like, they already had a room specifically set up for this at the venue. It's not like Yaga and Kino, who had to play the Sweden Major from their hotel rooms. But his teammate Bursa also tests positive, which apparently was enough reason for Atheros to be outright disqualified from participating in the qualifier. Rightfully so, I suppose. Latin American Twitter just blows up. Everyone starts sharing videos and experiences. The Atheros owner essentially confirms he's pulling out of Rainbow Six because of this whole debacle. M King just leaves the team straight up. It's safe to say the dam has been broken. From the official Atheros Esports Twitter account, there's also an email screenshot that's floating around that mentions that ESL is supposed to give the teams an ability to still play like teams from the Sweden Major did, but I've been trying to find out what rulebook or regulation would allow them to do this kind of thing, but I'm looking for something official to confirm whether this is legit. Either way, the Atheros Esports Twitter account posts that they're still supposed to be playing and that they're outraged by this decision. They were meant to be playing the first game of the qualifier, but then the schedule gets moved up to the second game, which is Black Dragons against Furious. They get through setup, map bans, and through the first 3 rounds on Coastline, where Black Dragons leads 2-1, when suddenly the whole tournament gets completely suspended. Evidently, this was a call made by ESL despite Ubisoft Brazil advocating that the tournament should progress. Ubisoft releases a statement saying that 2 players tested positive and that they received additional reports that not all safety measures were followed, and they're postponing the qualifier until they double-check their safety measures and explore options to resume it. From this point, all Mexican and South American players then get taken back to their hotels and told to stay in their rooms without adequate communication or a clarification on whether they're meant to be quarantining. Bursa and Royce, because of those positive tests, get taken to a different hotel, but back at the main one, that's where you've probably seen the pictures of the food they were given. I remember some of the jokes we made about the food players got back at the Six Invitational last year, but this might be the first time I've seen a prominent TO give Cheetos to players for breakfast. That's a new one. Soko from Malvinas then tests positive in the middle of this whole mess, and he's moved to a different hotel, though whether that's the same hotel as Bursa and Royce is something I can't quite figure out. Meanwhile, Black Dragons and MIBR don't have to worry about any of this because they live in the same city, so they just go right back to their gaming houses and homes and continue scrimming, something that the international teams can't do because they don't have PCs in their hotel rooms. And apparently Black Dragons starts scrimming on Coast because that was the map they started playing on right before everything got shut down. And this is despite both Brazilian teams evidently also being in close contact with the Atheris players who just tested positive. According to players, communication is extremely lackluster from TO to teams at this point, and everyone is just getting more understandably frustrated. Players spend anywhere from 24 to 30 hours in their rooms before finally being allowed out to use the common areas, which doesn't really fit with any kind of quarantine procedure. Finally, teams get an internal message saying that the qualifier is going to be played online like every other SI qual, and that more COVID tests would be available the following day. The thing is, in order to return home, the international teams need a confirmed negative PCR test before flying back the next day, but they're told that PCR tests can't be administered on Sundays in Brazil, which, according to people I've spoken to, is complete bullshit. So at least for Furious and Malvinas, the plan for the 17th is this: leave the airport at 1:30 p.m., arrive, purchase tickets on short notice, queue for and take the PCR tests, get results, and then board a flight back to Buenos Aires. But even that plan is met with failure, as there isn't enough time to complete that laundry list, and all players just end up going back to the hotel that night with no tests completed and no flights boarded. There's even more that's happened since yesterday. Like, this is still technically a developing situation. The car that was meant to be delivering their PCR tests crashed on the way there, from what the players are saying. Apparently some players have now managed to fly back home, but still others from Malvinas and Furious have tested positive and are now being put through additional quarantine regulations in Brazil from anywhere from 11 to 12 days. I don't, like, I'm not even there, and I really hate this. Let's just go back over this again. A qualifier of 6 teams has seen at least 7 players test positive for COVID, the tournament be indefinitely postponed, 1 team completely disbanding with another intending to withdraw, players who can't fly back home for several days due to quarantine restrictions, and who can't play the tournament if it were restructured to happen online, 1 really promising gunner already retiring from Siege and going to compete in Valorant instead, and sadly, that isn't even a perfect summary of the aftermath of this whole ordeal. I am not interested in mudslinging or dogpiling on anybody who had to organize this, but if I were any of the players caught in this crossfire, I would be concerned. This is concerning. Not just because of the apparent lack of enforcement of COVID-19 safety protocols, but the lack of communication to help reassure players about their situation, and the timing mismanagement to ensure everyone can get back home if that's what the new ruling requires. This stuff is just unacceptable. Even if there are elements of this situation that have probably been embellished by players for the sake of Twitter impressions, like the fact that we're even talking about Cheetos for breakfast, or disqualification despite there being a dedicated room for players being set up at the venue, or everyone riding in the same freaking van, is just a sign that this is fantastically clumsily organized. I'm like trying my hardest to look for silver linings or things in this scenario that were done correctly, but that gets difficult when your plans keep on changing and deteriorating as frequently as they have over the past 5 days or so. I want to believe that those who have this organized had everyone's health and safety as their top priority, but there's enough individual accounts of contradictory COVID regulations that make me doubt if this was thought through effectively enough. And everything presented so far also does have me concerned for the Invitational itself. Like, one of the teams that was meant to have won that qualifier is also meant to be traveling to Stockholm. Can you imagine what would happen if SI itself were botched as badly as this qualifier would have been? The esports scene as a whole would be in an uproar. At the time of recording, there hasn't been any official word as to when the tournament's going to be rescheduled for, or even if a tournament's going to take place at all at this point. The good news is that getting into Sweden is considerably easier than getting into Canada, but that, again, that's me digging pretty deep to find something positive to talk about. And also, like I mentioned, the situation itself is still developing. There are going to be a lot of people who will be angry no matter what situation or solution is presented here. I wouldn't be surprised if they decide that one of the teams that was like the least affected, so like Black Dragons, MIBR, or maybe Phoenix, if one of them just gets like a direct invite of some kind, that wouldn't shock me, or if they just find a way to play with just those 3 teams, something like that that doesn't incorporate any of the teams that have been affected would just I don't know, dude. What options do you have? Honestly, this is the kind of story I don't know if I would have paid that much attention to had it not been for me, like, religiously reading the R6 Pro League subreddit. So hats off to everyone over there who's been finding all of these player accounts and photos and videos of the whole situation, everyone who's been linking TwitLongers. And I think a big majority of the English-speaking audience would have also missed out on stuff like this had it not been for them compiling all of this information together. So hats off to you, gentlemen, for managing to keep all of this stuff, like, current and keeping us up to date. Consider this like the video companion to all of that, just to keep everything in one place. It's a mess. This is probably one of the single most cursed events that Siege has ever seen with these kinds of stakes. I don't know how this happened. I don't know how we got here. And I don't know what's coming next. But for the love of God, I hope everyone, players, staff, organizers, are able to get this one figured out, get everyone home safe, and ensure that any mistakes that have been made over the past week are not made for the big dance when that finally comes up in Stockholm. Because, good God.